One, two, three.
While our weekly shows are edited to time for broadcast on public TV and community radio, we offer to our supporting members and podcast subscribers the full Uncut conversation. The following is from our monthly Meet the BIPOC Press series. This time, we explore the top headlines of the month and stories you won't find in mainstream media. Laura's guests are Amir Khafagy, senior labor reporter for Documented New York, and Aallyah Wright, rural issues reporter for Capital B, reporting on the South. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters.
Are you an avid news and public affairs consumer? Think you know what's going on? You may have your finger on all the important pulses, but if you rely on so-called mainstream or commercial media, it is far more likely that you are missing out. Do you know all you need to know about the U.S. farm workers organizing right now and the resistance of farmers in these times? What about the facts on who is voting how in the New York City mayor's race? Here at Laura Flanders and Friends, we do our best to go beyond the standard headlines. And so today in the monthly feature we call Meet the BIPOC Press, it is my pleasure to have a couple of journalists whose reporting helps us fill some critical gaps. Covering the U.S. South, I am glad to be joined by Aallyah Wright, the rural issues reporter for Capital B, and from New York, a familiar face, Amir Khafagy, senior labor reporter with Documented. What is happening that money media are missing, and what strategies do these reporters and their outlets have for surviving in these times? We're about to find out. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to start with a quick round of what you're excited or aghast about. And let's start with you, Amir. What do you think is the most important story that money media are missing in this moment? Spill the beans.
That's a very good question. Thanks for having me on, Laura. What I'm really disappointed in the fact is the mainstream media is not talking about the effect that workplaces are experiencing right now in terms of ICE raids. I'm hearing a lot of things on the ground in which employers are threatening workers, immigrant workers, with deportation if they report wage theft that's happening or any other kind of issues that are happening on the workplace. And this is something that seems to be growing nationally. And in New York, it's happening. I think I've heard dozens of cases so far.
So using that threat of deportation or raid by ICE as a kind of bludgeon to threaten workers.
Yes, 100%.
What about you, Aallyah? What's riling you up?
Yeah, I think it's just the culmination of things that are impacting Black farmers. I mean, they literally cannot catch a break. I think I've been seeing a lot of news coverage about, what's coming out of the USDA when we talk about office closures or folks being laid off or these different, grants that are being cut and programs that are being terminated. But they're not always focused on the realities of what that looks like for Black farmers, given, the history of the fraught relationship between Black farmers and the USDA and the historic discrimination, all of those things. And so I would love to just see more about what does it look like? What is the real impact on these farmers as they're, navigating all of these different changes?
So important. So not just to focus on the bureaucrats, but the actual people on the receiving end of these policy changes. You reported on one seemingly obscure policy change recently that has massive implications, a rule change. Can you talk about that, Aallyah?
I can. So last week, the USDA announced that it is eliminating the term socially disadvantaged. And basically, that term describes people who have been subjected to racial, ethnic, and gender discrimination, including, Black folks, Asian, Hispanic, Native communities. And with that, they also said that they will no longer consider race or sex in its decision-making processes on programs. So this is basically falling in line with what we saw earlier this year with President Trump and his executive orders that basically, terminates anything that is even in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I think something that was really interesting that was in that notice and a reason why they're, no longer using this term is that they feel they have sufficiently addressed their historic discrimination. And I consistently hear about cases with Black farmers who are still enduring discrimination by the USDA. There's still lawsuits that are being filed regarding discrimination. And so there's a lot of, again, funding and programs that have been attached to this term socially disadvantaged. And so that would essentially be completely nixed.
It's so important, the reporting that you're doing, Aallyah, and it's important that people get beneath the headlines of that story in particular. Because if you don't understand what the USDA, that's the US Department of Agriculture, even does, which most urban readers really don't know, and most of our media is urban based, you don't understand what the implications of a rule change like that might be. Now, we're going to get to you, Amir, but while we're on this, Aallyah, remind our audiences what the USDA does for farmers and has historically done much more for white farmers than for Black farmers or women.
Yeah, the USDA is a fairly large organization with numerous agencies that provide resources and technical assistance, loans to farmers. They also have like a rural development arm. So they focus on, particular resources for rural communities with housing and broadband, and there's some other programs there. But the largest part of the organization is their work that they do with farmers through the Farm Servants Agency, again, which administers loans, and other agencies like Natural Resource Conservation Service and a few others.
Yeah, I mean, and loans being so critical for farmers who often have to put out before they can get back. And who have to invest in new equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So just to give people a sense of what they're missing out on when the story only talks about the bureaucrat in Washington, much as we care about them too. Coming to you, Amir, I don't know whether there's a comparable story to the one that Aallyah just told, but is there a story you're following that illustrates that same problem that you kind of need to know more than the headline?
Well, it's interesting. New York has had a really sweltering summer. We've been bombarded by heat wave after heat wave after heat wave. It's terrible. And there was a law in Albany that was supposed to kind of help workers that work outdoors. It was called the Temp Act, right? So there was this law that was going to provide heat protections for workers. The law did not pass this legislative session. It was introduced, I believe, in 2024. It wasn't passed, even though workers and worker advocate groups have been advocating for this law to get passed. I was able to come across a memo that was leaked to me from the New York Farm Bureau, which is the largest lobbying group of the farm industry and the agricultural industry in New York. And in that memo, they made the case against the Temp Act. And one of the reasons they gave that stated that the law wasn't necessary was that because Caribbean workers and Latino workers are immune somehow to high temperatures, that they can work comfortably in high temperatures, and they were promoting this racist language that harkened back to like eugenics language, and they were proudly sending this out to all the different politicians throughout the state.
You mean, so if you come from a country that they think is hot, that's just fine for you to be toiling in temperatures that make people's blood boil?
That's what they were arguing, despite the fact that Black and Latino workers are more likely to die because of heat exhaustion and extreme temperatures than any other worker. So it boggles the mind that they were openly saying this without any shame, and they weren't hiding this. They were sending this out to all the most prominent politicians in the state.
So what happened? I mean, this Temp Act, temperature, not temporary, Temp Act, you managed to reveal this memo. Then what happened?
Nothing. It got a lot of attention. It came out last week, but nothing happened. I hope that next legislative session, that with the revelation of this memo, it would put a little more impetus on the advocates and some of the politicians that were sitting on the fence. But the New York Farm Bureau spent billions of dollars to stop this law, as well as other big businesses such as the airline industry. I heard just anecdotal evidence that Delta was one of the also main lobbyists against the Temp Act, because airport workers working on those hot tar mats throughout the summer are being exposed to some of the most egregious heat that is imaginable. Some workers, I did another story, they were denied water on hot days while they were working at LaGuardia Airport.
And this has been a huge national story, Aaliyah. I'm sure you've been following this question of just the right to water. When it broke in Texas that there were legislators opposing the right to water for their workers on the fields, it was like a scandal. Oh, those Texans. But clearly it's not a Texan problem. It's a New York problem, maybe a national one.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate, but I think that speaks to the importance of our voices and holding folks accountable and staying on those stories and even diving deeper. You know, building, I'm sure, Amir, you had to build trust with those folks to get that memo for them to leak it to you so that you would have that additional insight. And so I just urge, if they're, for journalists who are watching this, that we have to keep the pulse on the issues. We have to keep our ear to the ground and connect it with folks in the community who are, again, being impacted by a lot of these things that are happening, but may not even have the platform necessary to speak their truth, or even or who are speaking their truth and having it dismissed by the people that in power, who are passing these particular policies and laws.
Well, it would be interesting to do a little survey of how many of the people currently in Congress have any relationship to rural issues or the rural experience. I remember when they were doing away with welfare and passing welfare reform years ago, it was clear that not only did the people in Congress who were voting on this have no experience ever of having been on welfare or benefited from that sort of support, but neither had their staff people. They literally had just no connection to such a critical issue, which is why it's so important, the work that you two are doing. And maybe this is a good moment for you to tell us a little bit about yourselves and your outlets and what makes you different. Amir, our audience may feel like they know you, but maybe they don't. What would you share about what you bring to your reporting in the way of a lens, and maybe what documented is in the way of a different sort of media outlet?
Well, Documented New York is one of the only newsrooms, if not the only newsroom in New York City, that focuses on immigrant communities in the city and the vast array of immigrant communities in the city. We focus on the Caribbean community, on the Chinese community, on the Latino community. So we really tell stories that the mainstream media has kind of overlooked, and sometimes they even copy us. Stories that we've done maybe a few months ago, you'll see a similar story in the New York Times and stuff. So I really think Documented is the trendsetter in New York City in terms of reporting on communities that really go underlooked. And even in urban environments, there are plenty of rural places within the urban environment. People really don't look at places like in New York City, Rockaway, Queens, it really gets overlooked, or Coney Island, or some of these places that are at the far stretches of the city that really don't get the attention either from the news or from politicians. So what we strive to do, and what I strive to do as a reporter, is to constantly try to go into those communities and see what's happening and show how the issues that they're facing is really a citywide, if not national, issue.
Now, it's been a convention in conventional media that people need to have an outside perspective to understand the story. So you have that phenomenon of kind of helicopter journalism, where somebody is sent from a town that, where they live, to a far different place to do the objective reporting on that place. You have not done that, Amir, right?
No, I'm from New York City. I'm born and raised, if you can't tell from my accent. I'm from Queens, New York. My father's an immigrant from Egypt, and he was a cab driver for many years. My mother is Puerto Rican from the Bronx, and I really grew up in New York City in a working class community. I've done stories on the plight of cab drivers from my firsthand experience as my father is a cab driver. I lived just a mile from LaGuardia Airport, and now I've done a lot of stories exposing some of the egregious worker violations that are occurring at the airport. And I have this connection with those communities because I not only report on those communities, I'm from those communities.
Well, that goes to what you were saying, Aaliyah, about what it takes to build trust also. But tell us a little bit about you and your outlet, Capital B.
Yeah, so Capital B, we're a local national nonprofit news organization that covers Black communities across the country.
Now, what does it mean to be local national? Sorry.
So we have two local newsrooms, one in Atlanta, Georgia, and the other in Gary, Indiana. And then I'm a part of our national team, and we're kind of scattered out across the country. And again, to Amir's point, like, we cover the communities that are often underrepresented in mainstream media, or we cover the stories that are not often being covered by mainstream media. I mean, look at my beat in particular when we talk about rural America, oftentimes the coverage is synonymous with white or conservative, but there's a heavily Black rural population, particularly in the South. And so being from the Mississippi Delta, a super rural um region in Mississippi, I know from my experience living there, so my lived experience, my looking at my families and my friends, and also just what I've learned as a reporter, I feel that there's a huge responsibility for me to cover these stories with humanity and empathy and compassion, and through the lens again of what it's like to live in these places day in and day out. There are communities where I have to travel to that I may have never been to before, but guess what? I'm putting in the work to reach out to those folks, to have these conversations, to allow that time for them to get to know me and my intentions and why our newsroom, exists in the first place. And so it's what I love about Capital B in terms of just having the freedom to tell fuller stories with context and nuance, but also, explore the systemic challenges, but also look at the joy, the faith, the food, the traditions, all of the things that make these communities who they are.
Well, I was going to say you've been doing some reporting on the resistance that's building and the organizing that's happening, and that's an important part of the equation too. You want to share any of what you've been finding on that front?
Yeah. I mentioned earlier how there's just this kind of, I I don't like to say perfect storm because there's a lot of destruction and chaos that seems to be
It's
happening.
hurricane season. Let's not talk storm.
Well, you're right. Like, let me take a beat. But yeah, again, with all of, the elimination of grants and funding through the USDA and the federal government, what I've been finding is that one, Black farmers are very resilient. And oftentimes they tell me time and time again, we've been through this before, just given the fact that they've always had to do more with less. So they're used to having limited resources, but they're not deterred by what's happening, on the federal level. They're actually more motivated. They're, passing on their wisdom. They're working to train up the next generation of farmers. And part of that is also changing the image and perception of what it means to be a farmer. A lot of young folks think that you're just a super old person who's, pushing pushing equipment or physically, picking cotton, like these very outdated images of what it means. And so part of that is like exposing folks to all of the different facets of agriculture. Like, you don't have to just be in farming. Maybe there's something with technology. Maybe there's something with curating events like farm to table. So they're very energetic. And it's really inspiring to see that no matter, what's happening outside of, their bubble, if you will, of where they are, they're super rooted in their work. And they're just trying to do more to increase the number of folks who are a part of this industry.
And I should say that we're going to put links to some of the articles that you have all written at our website in our program notes, especially with our podcast. You find all the program notes for our episodes. Coming to you, Amir, on this question of energy, there was a lot of energy flowing in and around the mayoral primaries this summer. What did you find in the coverage there that was lacking? Because you can't say there wasn't a lot of it. There was.
Oh, it's probably one of the biggest news stories to come out of New York in a long time. Um, I think with Zohran's candidacy, there's
We're
a
talking
lot
about
of
Zohran Mamdani, the Democratic Socialist, came from what the media felt was the margins and just wiped the floor with the former governor, Andrew Cuomo.
well, if you know anything about Queens, he didn't just come out of nowhere. He's been around for quite some time. Um, I think in the mainstream media there was this conversation happening around maybe it was like the gentrifier class and the hipsters were the ones that really were coming out and voting for him. And that may have been true to some extent, but immigrant communities, especially Asian immigrant communities, were really excited for him. He really represented something different in New York that people haven't heard about in such a long time. Como represented the status quo. He represented more of the same in a city that's becoming increasingly expensive, a city becoming increasingly unaffordable. With Zohran, there was a lot of optimism and hope, and maybe he may not even be able to achieve some of the things he's doing, but he at least is striving to do something different. And I think that really resonated with the vast majority of people in working class neighborhoods in Queens who really came out and voted for him. Some of the districts in Queens that even went Trump voted for Zohran, which is very interesting to see. It's like people want authenticity. They want a politician that is going to represent some sense of change. And I think with his winning of the Democratic primary, I think that shows that people want change, and you can't dismiss them.
They want to see change. They want to see their candidate. I mean, he showed up, South Asian. He went to, he talks about how he went specifically to the communities and even the voters who had voted for Trump and asked them why did they do it and what are they looking for. And then he spoke to exactly that.
I saw him multiple times on the campaign trail by himself, walking I live in Jackson Heights. He came to Jackson Heights several times. I bumped into him in front of the post office by my house. He showed up. He was there. He was shaking hands. He wasn't afraid of having conversations with all kinds of people. If you saw him, he wouldn't shun away from you. He would come right up and shake your hand. And people like that. Como, on the other hand, hid behind a whole plethora of PR people and advisors that kind of insulated him. He wasn't in touch with the people. What he sold was the politics of fear. And Zohran, he gave the politics of hope.
Now, we should say that as we're recording this, Andrew Cuomo is back in the race, announced an independent candidacy. And I will toot our own horn here at Laura Flanders and Friends, in that we covered a race not unlike this, very different in many different ways, in many important ways, but a race in Buffalo, New York, in the mayor's race of Buffalo, New York, a few years ago, where there was a candidate who was a grassroots organizer, India Walton, who won the primary because the incumbent Democrat didn't even think they had to run. They won in a low turnout primary. They were the Democratic candidate. And as soon as Zohran Mamdani won his primary this year, my mind went back to that race and what happened. And it was a race that was poorly covered and poorly understood by most media. And we happen to know India through her work in land trusts and cooperative economics and solidarity economics. We went up there several times, and I felt like I had that connection that draws you to a story and helps you follow it. But as I sit in New York City, I think, wow, I'm glad I had that under my belt to know what questions, in a way, to ask as a journalist about this race in New York. All of which is coming back around, Amir, to asking you, what are the questions that you think people need to be asking right now? And where do you think that important story that made headlines after the election, after the primary, stands? We can't afford just to wait to see what the election results will be next time.
I think the number one conversation that is to be had is about affordability. I think that's what's on the ballot. Not public safety is always a fear that a lot of people have, but I think that's overblown, and I think that's what Adams and Comer are selling. I think I'm not going to say who I support in the race, and although it may sound like I'm overly optimistic about Zohran. I think he should be held accountable to the same degree as any politician is, because I think all politicians should be held with a certain degree of skepticism and hope that we hope that they do well, but, we should challenge them when they don't. With Zohran, I think he still needs to create a sense of, he still has to answer a lot of policy questions in terms of how he's going to do some of the things that he promises, such as free busing and whatnot. But I think people really are excited for him. I'll tell you one quick anecdote. My father, who is an older gentleman, he's kind of, he tends to go where he wants to go. Sometimes he likes Trump, sometimes he likes the Democrats. You never know where he stands. He was like, Zohran, he's very good. If my father likes him, my mother likes him, a lot of people that usually wouldn't go towards him or into him. I think that shows that the city's entering a different political climate.
I mean, it really speaks to what we learn as journalists about what happens when we cover stories or when we don't. I was going to say, like, the importance of the stories that are submerged or not covered, like the story of how Zohran got those voters, feels to me like a story that candidates all across the country should hear. In the Buffalo case, you saw just an onslaught by the status quo to back the the defeated Democrat incumbent, and that Democrat ended up beating India Walton. And it was partly because the issues that she had raised just didn't get raised in the rest of the discussion. The discussion then became her credentials versus his, etc. And you felt like the end of the story was a kind of lesson to candidates: don't do this. And I think sometimes I feel like feels like there's almost an agenda to discourage people or to alienate people or to make people feel that things are useless when we don't cover certain stories or certain angles of certain stories. I don't know whether you're resonating with any of this, Aallyah, but as you look at the stories that are covered and are not covered, why do you think what you're doing is so important? You're telling stories that need to be told, but I also think there's more to it than that. It's something about the effect on our democracy.
I think what makes the work that I'm doing and what we're doing at Capital B so important, and I feel like this is, again, so basic, but simply listening. And the reason I say that is because I can't tell y'all how many emails I get from folks across the country, some who are not even really technologically savvy, but can send an email because literally their local council person, an attorney, a civil rights or nonprofit organizations, whoever those who are supposed to be support systems for them in their community, are just not listening. And so I will take the time to sit on the phone for an hour if I have to with someone. If I have the time. We don't always have the time. Just to hear what the challenges are, just to hear what the fight is about, just to hear how these very important, again, policies or laws or whatever is happening is truly impacting the way that they're able to live their lives. And again, it's back to that humanity thing. Like, we all have so many things in common if we just take the time, again, to sit, listen, and explore those different intersections, whether it's healthcare, whether it's workers' rights, whether it's, again, we're talking about food and agriculture, whether it's education. How can we, through the stories of these very real people, how can we allow their humanity to resonate with us, and how, those issues on, a local level speak to a lot of what we're seeing across the country. And I think that's really the beauty of it.
I mean, what I'm hearing is something about the shaping of the story of our society, our democracy, of what's possible, what's painful, what's actually hurting people, is so influenced by the media that we have. And I hear from a lot of people that they've just kind of turned off the news because what they're consuming, which is mostly commercials, still somewhat television, a lot of social media, is just so alienating, really.
Yeah, and it's like, how can we be in partnership with the people that we're covering? How can we allow them to help shape and form these stories? You know what I mean? Oftentimes, if something comes out of, the Trump administration, or again, the USDA, I'm not picking on them. It's just I've been covering a lot of the USDA. When these things come down and they're announced, a lot of times it's like, oh, the USDA has done XYZ, right? But we don't, how often are people flipping, those stories to say this particular person is going through this, and because of this policy or this legislation, now their life will, be transformed in a negative, or whatever that, that impact looks like. And then get into the people, like, how can we give the power to the people when we're framing and shaping these stories? And I think, again, it just speaks to the freedom that, I have and other folks have at Capital B, and a lot of, again, independent media organizations to do that.
I'm glad you brought us back around to that question, and I want to ask you, Amir, if you want to address this sort of media shaping role question, but where I'm going, I think, is as we're speaking, you see this organized assault. It's decades long, but seems to be coming to fruition at this moment on public media, on sort of legacy public broadcasting and television. Think NPR, think public television. the funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that supports those institutions, if not programs like this one, but institutions that air programs like this one, is being clawed back to the tune of $1.1, I think, billion over a couple of years. It will leave a huge hole in the media budgets of those institutions. And my question, I guess, to the two of you is, do you see your organizations as filling that gap? Is it time to let go, perhaps, of that legacy history, at least at the level of government support for public broadcasting? I know what I think about that, but I'd love to hear from you. Amir, is you the future? We should just stop looking back.
In short, yes, I think we are the future. But in general, like, to your earlier question, I think it's really important for media outlets like Document in New York, and Capital B and the city and all these other outlets. If they're on the ground, we're on the ground. We're seeing things that the mainstream media isn't. The popularity of a candidate like Zohran or AOC what came as a surprise to organizations like the New York Times. But we were on the ground all the time, and we were able to see what the trends were and where things were going, and we saw it. We were doing reporting during the presidential election, and we saw a lot of immigrant communities turning towards Trump, while the polls and the mainstream media was saying that Trump doesn't have a chance, he wasn't going to win. And we were kind of saying, well, if Flushing, Queens is going to vote Trump, maybe there's something here, there's something more. So we can see these trends that the mainstream doesn't see. In terms of public funding, I think public funding is very important for organizations like PBS and NPR, but it's really vital for organizations and nonprofit media like Document in New York, to not be so dependent on government funds. And what we do is we get a lot of donations from the very communities that we serve, and I think that's very important. Yes, there's donations from bigger nonprofits and bigger different other sources, philanthropy foundations, but we really get a lot of small individual donations from our readers, and that's keeping us afloat. And I think that's the future of a lot of media. And I think there's a lot of media going in that direction. And I think that also holds us accountable to the communities that we're reporting on and reporting for and reporting with.
So it's a plus as well as a minus. Aaliyah.
Yes. I mean, you're singing to the choir because we're, as you know, we're a nonprofit too. So most of, our funding is relying on foundations and grants, but a lot of the funding also comes from folks who are just everyday people who want to support the work because they love what we're doing. And to your point, it does have that level of accountability because they can call us out. They can also snatch their donations if they feel like the work isn't of quality or what we said we're going to do. Right. And I feel like we need more journalists. We don't need less. So I'm always in favor of more media. I know we're in a time of like the evolution, or maybe all of these changes that are happening around social media and the content creators and all of that. But it's like, how can, we teach more people or train more people how to do this work responsibly? If there are folks with this huge following where folks are going to get the news, there's something there, right? So how can we also, I guess, kind of wrap our arms around others and bring them to the fold so that they can do responsible journalism if that's the route that they're going towards in terms of sharing stories and updates on the news. But yeah, always in favor of diversifying the funding if we can, because we know we just can't rely on one source, fortunately. But yeah, we just need more journalists, period.
More journalists, some good institutions with the stability to be able to train some folks, and of course, more people engaged with their media. I don't just mean reporting, but supporting the media outlets that they care about. So thank you both. It's really been fun to talk with the two of you, and I hope that we get to do it again soon. And thank you for your work. It's very, very strikingly important.
Thank you
for having us.
Thanks for taking the time to listen to the full conversation from this month's Meet the BIPOC Press series. You'll find more information in the podcast description, including a link to the full episode notes posted at patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters. Please join our members now by making a one-time donation or make it monthly. All the details are at lauraflanders.org/donate. And thanks again to all our member supporters.